making sure that we have all the resources we need to get this great locomotive on the road and bring it here to Fort Worth.
Tell you what, we'll work on Austin. We'll get them up here by the end of the tour. Here's our first question. Give us your name, where you're from, and what is the question?
Hi, Scott Land, Fort Worth, Texas. I was wondering how they generated power on the locomotive before, AC power and stuff. There are steam generators.
Question, sir, if I heard you correctly, were you asking about how a steam locomotive is powered?
Like for your cab lights and just your basic onboard power.
We have what's known as a Pio National MO6 turbo generator, and it's a steam turbine that runs an armature. We rewired one to produce 74 volts DC output. We use that for our PTC, and we also have a 32 volt DC for our headlight and our vehicle radio. We've got like an automobile radio in the cab. So it's the same technology they had. We simply rewired one of them to produce the same voltage that the modern auxiliary generator on a diesel engine produces, because a lot of the instrumentation that we have uses that same voltage. So it's a very simple system, very reliable. When we start the locomotive up in the morning, you can hear those little whirring sound, and that's the turbines running. We call them a dynamo.
The high-pitched whistle you kind of hear when it's just cruising.
Yeah, we're going to add a third one so we can have a just additional source of power.
Okay. If you could state your name and where you're from.
Sean from Ft.Worth. My question is, how did you get the train from the Pomona Fair? Because that's where it used to be.
His question was, how did we bring the locomotive from Pomona, or how did we ask them to give it back to us? I'll go into a little bit of that. So we started this adventure back in 2012 when we decided to restore a 4000 class locomotive at Big Boy. And it's been something that I had wanted to do for some time. I took over as manager in 2010. There was a very small window of opportunity to get the 4023 before they put it on the hill up in Omaha, but I wasn't successful at convincing them to bring it to Cheyenne instead of putting it up on the hill. So a few years later I had an opportunity, and I had looked at a few of the 4000s, and I knew of all of them. And it's interesting, people, when you read stories on social media, this Union Pacific sent a crew around the country. No, we didn't. It was very simple. The 4014 was the one that was in the best condition because it was sitting in Los Angeles enjoying that nice dry desert climate. So we asked the Rail Giants Museum if they would be willing to give the locomotive back to us. And Steve Price, photographer, he was right there. Very, very good entrance. And they very graciously allowed to return the locomotive back, and we spent several months preparing the locomotive so we could move it back to Cheyenne and begin its restoration.
Hi, my name is Will. I'm currently residing in Fort Worth area. But I have a few questions. One, I tried several times to contact you, email or whatever, because I'm a toolmaker and machinist myself. And I would have loved at least, from a distance, overhaul the phone or do something, and trying to get through to you guys. Do you accept people doing it or measurements at farm work out? And if so, how do I?
Well, that's a good question, and as you can imagine, we've had lots of inquiries and lots of interest in the process of restoring the locomotive. And generally, we do everything in-house. that's a big advantage for us, is that who better to do the work than us, because we have control of the final product, and we're also the ones that are responsible for it. We outsourced a few big machining jobs, but everything else we do in-house. So I appreciate your interest in that. And tool and die making is in itself somewhat of a, I don't want to say it's a lost art, but it's a rare job in our world today.
I am Axel. I'm 13 and I'm from Glenrose, Texas. I just want to know why you always have a diesel engine on the back of the big boy.
That's a very good question, Axel, and thanks for asking that. We get that question frequently. So if you think about what a modern steam locomotive is today in the world that it operates in a foreign land. A steam locomotive doesn't have many friends around anymore. There's no water towers, there's no roundhouses. When a steam locomotive was running back when they were using them all the time, the railroad had a very, very comprehensive network of logistics. Lots of roundhouses and all that very complex infrastructure to care for that locomotive and all of its brothers and sisters. So the steam locomotive has to have a lot of water and a lot of fuel. The train that just went by here had 3 big modern locomotives on them. And they'll put fuel in those locomotives at intermediate points along the way, but aside from that, those are going to keep running unless they experience some type of mechanical condition where they don't work anymore. A steam locomotive can go maybe 100 miles or more before it needs to be replenished with fuel, water, sand, grease, and oil. And in addition to that, because of the nature of the design, a steam locomotive produces its power in a little bit of a different fashion. And when it does, it's vibrating, pounding. And that pounding and that vibration can loosen nuts and bolts and all kinds of parts. So when they built these locomotives, they were a result of many decades of trial and error and evolutionary design, and they're very modern. And so the nuts and bolts don't get quite so loose like they used to, but they still can. When we get here to Fort Worth, we have to go underneath the locomotive. When they would use the locomotives back in those days, they would bring them into a roundhouse where they would get them over a pit, which is an area where you can walk underneath the locomotive and look at all the various things underneath it. When we put the locomotive back together, we made it such that we didn't have to service it underneath. There's grease fittings and all kinds of stuff all over that locomotive. Another thing about the locomotive is, as we experienced yesterday was a very good example of this, is our fuel and water is limited because we have, if you can see the fire hose working its way up to the tool car, we're pumping on about 55,000 gallons of water that we use between McAllister and here. So if we didn't have that diesel locomotive with us, when we had our 2-hour delay yesterday, we wouldn't have been able to make it here, and we wouldn't be talking here right now. We'd be out probably 20 miles to the north where we ran out of fuel. So the diesel locomotive, what it does is it helps us extend the range. So instead of working the steam locomotive really hard, we can work it moderately hard and work the diesel a little bit, and that helps us extend our fuel and water. And the other really important part is the wear and tear on the brakes, not so much on the train, but on the locomotive. Next time you have a chance to get up next to the big boy locomotive, behind all of the drivers are not 1, but 2 big cast iron brake shoes that we had made custom. They're specific to the big boy. They don't fit the 844, they don't fit the 3985, they only fit the 4014, so they're very custom. To change those things requires us to get underneath and loosen the brake rigging so we can move what we call the brake head, the part that holds that brake shoe, so we can put a new one in. Well, we would prefer not to do that out here. We would prefer to do that in a pit. So to lessen the wear and tear on the brake shoes, I'll use dynamic brakes. Everybody know what dynamic braking is? That's an electronic brake system that the modern diesel locomotives has. It's very efficient. So when we go down long descending grades, all we have to do is call the engineer running the 4015 and I'll say, hold us right here, and we just go right down the hill smooth as silk. If we didn't have the diesel, I'd need to apply the air brakes and release them multiple times to control our speed as we're going down those hills. Does anybody notice the number of that engine we have back there? A 4015. So it's the modern day brother to the 4014.
My name is Ryan, and I'm 7 years old, and I want to ask who gave it the name Big Boy, and when did it get, and when was it named?
That's a very good question. What was your name? I didn't get that.
Ryland.
All right, Rylan, what a good question. Rylan asked, when did the Big Boy get its name and when was it named? Well, as the story goes, at the American Locomotive Company, what a cool name for a locomotive building company, isn't it? They had built thousands of locomotives before the 4000 class. And here's a locomotive company that encompassed an area as large as this big opening that we're in. It's a giant industrial heavy-duty factory that mass produces locomotives. So those guys and gals working on those locomotives were no stranger to big equipment, but they hadn't ever seen anything as big as a Big Boy before. And the very first one, the number 4000, when they got it all put together, and before they painted it, they pushed it out on a track called a ready track, where they're going to start steaming it up to do testing. And somebody got up on the smoke box, and with chalk, they wrote the words, Big Boy. And that name stuck. So a tribute to all the men and women that spent all the years in their careers working on not only locomotives, but all industrial parts of our great country. We pay tribute to them, and we honor them by occasionally writing Big Boy on the locomotive. When the rain washes it off, we'll leave it off for a while, and then as a surprise, we'll write it back up there. That's a very good question.
Great question.
My name is Madison. I'm 10 years old, and I'm from Ft.Worth, Texas. And I want to know how much horsepower it has.
Madison, another very good question. So when you start talking about horsepower and steam locomotives, you have to be careful, because how many rail fans are in our audience right here? How many steam locomotive aficionados read books and study? So there was an article back in 1941 with Railway Age magazine, and they had a very nice article extolling the virtues of this new design. And it was the 7,000 horsepower locomotive built for Union Pacific. When they tested the locomotives, this one particularly was part of the testing. You can still see some of the test apparatus that they have welded to some of the boiler and some of the steam piping. They produced right around 6,500 horsepower, about 14, 15 miles an hour. So horsepower is a little bit of a different comparison when you're comparing it to a steam locomotive versus a diesel. So we refer to it as 7,000 horsepower. That's the output, how much power the boiler can actually produce. It's a little bit different when you start comparing it to what it can actually pull. Did that answer your question, Madison? That's a good question.
Hello, my name is Ashel Piver, and I'm from Sweetwater. I wanted to ask if the Union Pacific has any intentions, albeit as impractical as they are, to run 4014 and any revenue-earning freight trains as it was originally designed to do.
His question was, are we going to use the locomotive in regular service? Well, the short answer to that is the regular service that it's performing now is this type of service. In terms of pulling a freight train, the logistics alone would significantly offset what other benefit there would be other than a public relations benefit. The locomotive's just a heavy-duty rock-crushing machine, but it's got a voracious appetite for all the things that I mentioned: fuel, water, grease, oil, and our love caring hands, our care and feeding. So we'll do whatever the Union Pacific asks us to do. If they want us to pull a freight train and there's a good PR benefit for that, we can't wait for that day.
Here we are.
Hi Ed, my name is Timothy. My hometown is Hays, Kansas. I first want to say thank you so much for just your love and passion for making this machine go. Being a railroad enthusiast since I was 2 years old, it's a dream come true to to see a big boy in action. And my question is, as I mentioned, from a young age, I've always been fascinated with trains, and it just kind of seems like just recently there's kind of been a renewed interest in bringing steam locomotives back to life, like the big boy right here. There was the Challenger, the UP 414, I believe. And my question ultimately is why didn't the Union Pacific preserve more steam locomotives when they were going after into retirement and keep them running for just kind of PR, nostalgia,
We can go if you
railroad
want to.
fanboys?
It's not massively critical.
Well, thank you for your question and thank you for your enthusiasm. If you look around here, there's a new generation that's coming in, and they're introduced to steam locomotives via Thomas the Tank Engine and other cartoon depictions of steam locomotives, and that's introduced them. It's probably no coincidence that at the time we began restoring the 4014, that helped renew a lot of additional interest in steam locomotive projects that had already been underway, and there is dozens upon dozens of other projects that are being considered as well. To your point about why didn't the Union Pacific, you have to think about it in the context of that time. Steam locomotives were very commonplace back then. Today they're very special. They're revered museum pieces, and we all appreciate them. We want to see them maintained and preserved. Back in the 1960s, they were cutting them up by the hundreds, by the thousands. It was really a matter of irony that the 844 was preserved in the manner it was, because it was scheduled to be stricken from the roster and possibly either donated or maybe even scrapped. The UP is one of the few railroads that maintained enough locomotives, or at least had some on the roster, so they could be used. Other railroads, for example, the Rio Grande, they didn't save a single locomotive. Again, it goes back to what a locomotive does, and when it reaches its end of its usable life, it's cast aside and new technology replaces it. We're very, very fortunate that our corporation has the foresight and has the backing of this program and continues this program to this day. When you consider what it does, what a steam locomotive does, it's a very, very unique special machine that requires all the special care and feeding that I've talked about to keep it operating in the field. And that's only part of what happens. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. You know, this old machine, it's a boiler, water, rust, corrosion. There's a lot of tinkering that goes on to keep these things maintained.
My name is Eric Young from Lancaster, Tennessee. I got two questions. How fast does the 4015, the one, the diesel, and how fast does that one go?
Very good question. They're both almost the same. The SD70s are geared for 70 miles an hour by timetable speed. Their overspeed is set just a few miles above that. Back before my steam locomotive career, I ran the SD70s quite a lot. They're my favorite locomotive model in our modern fleet today. The 4014's right about in that range too. You think about a 68-inch diameter driver. We talked a little bit in the last live session about the maximum speed, and I'll cover it here. It's part of an interesting kind of a, people when they see something big, we tend to assign unlimited power and unlimited speed capabilities to machines that we're fond of. But it's a machine, big mechanism. The way that it's designed, the engineering aspects of why it was designed to do what it was designed to do, limit it to probably right around 75 miles an hour. At 50 miles an hour, those drivers are spinning pretty good. It's covering a lot of ground. And you've got a tremendous amount of reciprocating mass, and all of that reciprocating mass has to be balanced very accurately. Well, this locomotive last received that order of balancing probably in the 1950s. So it's not as balanced as it was when it was brand new. In the years going forward, we're going to disassemble the wheels and do all the work necessary to continue to upgrade those pieces. We took the locomotive completely apart, except for the drivers. And as time goes on, that'll be our next big project. That's a very good question. and they're paired up really well.
Hello, I am Christopher from Amarillo, and I'm wondering, or actually I have two questions. Do you have any intentions to bring back another locomotive, and would it be possible to mock 4014 up as one of its fallen siblings like the 4019, the one with the smoke deflectors?
That's a good question. Generally, no. You know, we don't always say a hard no on anything, but we've got two locomotives in our fleet, the 844 and the 4014. In years past, we've had opportunities to help commemorate certain events with the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club, for example. They renumbered the Challenger, the 3967, for that specific event. So, generally speaking, we'll keep it renumbered the 4014. We'll keep it numbered the 4014.
Ed, I just have a really quick question. Can you tell us a little bit about what it takes to embark upon a 10-state tour? Do you look at the tracks? Do you inspect the tunnels and the bridges?
Yeah, that's a real fun aspect, and it's a very enjoyable part of my responsibilities is the planning. So the very detailed, all of the minutia that goes into running a steam locomotive like this. We used to run, back when I began this role in early 2011, I started planning my first trip, and I learned some pretty important lessons. When I was up in the locomotive cab, we would be coming into some territory that I wasn't familiar with, and we needed to go into specific tracks. And I thought to myself, well, I hope those tracks are okay. And the level of stress that I had, weeks out, wondering if those tracks were okay, has motivated me to become a very detailed person. So when I make we have an announcement, we speak internally about what our plans are, and we have trips projected out for 5 years that I provided our executive decision makers. So we have in draft form routes that I would like us to operate on that they've selected. So once we fine tune it and get it down to that point, I'll jump in a rental car and I'll take 5-6 weeks and I'll look at everything. I've been here. Most of all of this is areas that I've selected, either from an operational standpoint or from a public accessibility standpoint. We might have a few options, but oftentimes we're somewhat limited, and I'll use this as an example. When you go down to Tower 55, you've got a 13-degree curve that can get us into the old TMP station. The TMP station's really nice, but it's not good like this. We wouldn't be able to have this kind of openness and this kind of display, so we have to factor that in. Coming from McAllister is 189 miles. As we encountered yesterday, we had a few bits of congestion on the railroad. Well, that puts us toward the end of a long day. So being able to come right in and pull and stop is good. And that's all part of my calculus as I go. Checking the bridges, checking the tunnels, checking anything and everything. I run Google Maps, but seeing it for me. If I can't drive into a road, I can New Orleans, I walked 14 miles of track down there looking at every little detail.